Welcome everyone to tonight's Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Evelyn Hudehart, who was a BCDSS fellow not too long ago, right? Last year.
Yes.
Evelyn Hudehart has degrees from Stanford University on the BA in Political Science and the University of Texas at Austin with a PhD in Latin American and Caribbean history. She has taught at Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Michigan, City University of New York University, the University of Colorado at Boulder, and currently at Brown University, where she is Professor of History, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies. She received an honorary degree of law from the University of Notre Dame and was elected as an international fellow by the Academia Mexicana de la Historia. Historia? Never mind my accent, sorry. Evelyn Hudehart is the recipient of the 2010 Lifetime Achievement Award of the Association for Asian American Studies and also recipient of numerous research awards, including 2 Fulbrights, one to Brazil and the other one to Peru, a 3-year Kellogg National Leadership Award, and a 3-year Rockefeller Residency Fellowship in the Humanities. She has received funding at the Centennial Fellow of the American Council of Learned Scholars, ACLS, and as a Heinz Heinen Fellow of the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. Yay, and we were tremendously happy that you were here. And this was just last year. Her study and research travels have led her to 6 continents, and Evelyn Hudehart's professional life has focused on what Cuban historian Pérez de la Riviera calls the history of those without history. Among her numerous publications are over 20 journal articles in 5 languages and 3 books on the Yaqui Nation of the US-Mexican borderlands who have resisted external control for 500 years. She's currently, and now we're coming to today's topic, she's currently writing a book on the Chinese and Spanish in the Spanish Empire from Manila in the 16th and 17th century to Cuba in the 19th century, which actually leads me to the topic of today's Miller Lecture, in which Evelyn Hudehart will talk about degrees of freedom and Chinese contract laborers, so-called, quote, coolies, on Cuban sugar plantations in the 19th century, extensions of slavery or transitions to free labor. This is the question she will address in her lecture today. And a very, very warm welcome, Evelyn, that despite the crazy weather, you made it back to Bonn. So welcome.
Thank you all. I didn't realize that Bonn is so cold, but Pia warned me. So I brought lots of clothes. And so happy to be back here. I spent 4 wonderful summers here at the center. And I had my office mate, Richti, who's still here, and met many of you. And I'm just happy to be back to share some of the work I did this summer. I found out something that lots of people don't think about. That is, the Chinese were all over the Spanish Empire, from the very beginning to the very end of the empire. You could say that the Chinese bookended the Spanish Empire because they were in Manila in the 16th century. And Manila, of course, was part of Las Filipinas, which was colonized by Spain as its Pacific Empire. And then they were in Cuba in the last 50 years of the Spanish Empire in Cuba, because Cuba was one of the last colonies that Spain held on to until it could no longer do so. And so I am writing this book, as Pierre said, about the Chinese at both ends of the Spanish Empire, no? And trying to remind people that sometimes as scholars and historians, no, if you ask the right question, you might get answers you don't expect. So because I'm Chinese by birth, I was always very curious about the Chinese, history of the Chinese. And because I'm a Latin Americanist by training, those two just came together. And I discovered that the Chinese and the Spanish Empire had a lot to do with each other. So this is what I'm going to share today with you, in particular, this question of Chinese labor in Cuba. And they came under something called the Yellow Trade, or La Trata Amarilla. The Yellow Trade was a project by the Spaniards in Cuba. Remember, Cuba was still a Spanish colony, to bring Chinese laborers, commonly called coolies, to alleviate labor shortage on the island during the second half of the 19th century. Most of them, 80% or more, were destined to work alongside a dwindling African slave labor force on sugar plantations. The rest, some of them also work on coffee plantations as domestic servants and on state construction sites such as railroads and roads. But most of them, the vast majority, worked on the sugar plantations alongside African slaves. And this is what makes this history so unusual. So on one of the sheets that I put in front of you, if you look at the other side, I showed you the table of how many coolies, how many Chinese were brought into Cuba alongside how many slaves. And you know, the British ended slavery, and then they, in the early 19th century, then they wanted to blockade slavery throughout the Americas. And so these are official figures, of course. The number of slaves, started declining until 1866, when the last official shipment of slaves of 1,442 arrived. And look across at the column under coolies. That year, 1866, and the following year, the number of Chinese contract laborers jumped dramatically. And then I also correlated these two on the last column with the production of sugar. And you will see that Cuba was able to maintain its high production and increase its production of sugar. Now, I am not saying that the Chinese were the only factor accounting for the continuing increase in the production of sugar, but they were certainly an important factor. Okay, so I correlate these. We can come and refer back to this. Most of the Chinese then came from the south coastal provinces of Fujian province and especially of Guangdong province. Guangdong in the Western language is Canton, no? And the Canton province also lay at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta, and you can see that Hong Kong, which was taken by the British, leads to the British, and Macau, which was in the hands of the Portuguese, were also right there at the Pearl River Delta. So both of them would play a significant role. Now, what is unusual about these two provinces? They were coastal provinces, they were South China provinces, and they had long been exposed to Westerners, to Europeans. You've heard of Marco Polo, right? He traveled all the way through Fujian. You might have heard of the African called Ibn Battuta. He also traveled throughout Fujian province. And in Guangdong province, very famous because it's a site of the trade with many Western countries and the United States. It's what we call the factory cities, the trading post cities. So the people of Guangdong and Fujian were long exposed to Westerners, to foreigners, to Western ways, to Western language. Secondly, I should emphasize to you very quickly, but I don't have time to go into it. The people from especially Guangdong province were highly sophisticated, highly skilled, not only as agriculturalists or horticulturalists, but they were already deep into what we call a market economy. Of the thousands of small villages of 50 to 100 families in Guangdong province near Hong Kong and Macau, thousands of little villages, they had rotating markets. Every 2 weeks, every villager could go to a rotating market where they exchange goods and services with cash. So it's highly marketized economy. So they were great agriculturalists. They had skilled labor. They were new carpentry, for example, and they also already cultivated sugar in this area. No. Now look at this map. This is great. For most people crossing the Pacific as immigrants, you see that they could go just from China across the Pacific to Canada, to the United States West, San Francisco, and to Central America, to Mexico, to Panama, and all the way to Peru. But Cuba lies on the Atlantic side. No? So somebody drew this fabulous map with two Chinas. The Chinese to Cuba had to go a different route. No, they had to go through what is today Indonesia and all the way into the Indian Ocean, crossing the entire ocean, rounding the Cape of South Africa and into the Atlantic all the way to Cuba. And this voyage is very long, where you can see it's about twice as long as the Pacific voyage. Sometimes lasted 6 months. So it was a very arduous human trafficking. No? Same thing, the Chinese who went to Jamaica, all over the Caribbean, had to take this long route. No? Okay, so that I already explained that, all right? And here you see Cuba is a big island in the Caribbean. No, here's Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic. You can see all the islands, big and small. Here's Puerto Rico and a bunch of small islands. And here is Trinidad, Tobago, no? Trinidad, Tobago, almost at the tip of the South American continent. All of these places received Chinese laborers. Now, who are these laborers? Let me tell you. They came with bilingual contracts. And the contracts for the 125,000 Chinese, if you look at the table, you see the total number is about 125,000. When we say 125,000, we mean those who actually landed alive in Cuba. We think about 140 were actually taken out of China and loaded onto ships, but mortality rate was quite high on this arduous trip. So the 125 who landed in Cuba, they all had on them 8-year contracts. And these 8-year contracts never changed. No, the wording remained the same pretty much. No, and 8 years remained the same. That never varied. And as I said, it's a bilingual contract. So I gave you copies of the bilingual contract. One side is in Spanish. If you flip over, the other side is in Chinese. So I'm going to start with this document, and then I will go through, for the rest of my lecture, several other important documents. And most of the documents will feature the story of an actual person, to show how that person went from being bonded under 8 years to becoming a free person, to show the road from unfreedom or from bondage to freedom in one lifetime. Okay, so here we have the Spanish contract. Now, those of you who can read Spanish, if you read English, you can read Spanish, no? This is Compañía Cubana de Emigración para La Habana. It says that it is an immigration project, no, to Hawaii. The service, the business that engaged with the bringing in the Chinese, it's called a Cuban company of immigration. Sometimes it's listed at the top, Libre Emigración China para la Isla de Cuba. Free immigration to Cuba. So it's framed as an immigration project. And furthermore, the Chinese were in these documents, in the Spanish document, the term used for these Chinese laborers was not laborer, was not coolie. Coolie is just a common, ordinary, everyday word that was used. They were called colono asiático. They were called a colonist or a settler. No, because in keeping with colonization, in keeping with immigration. So it's an immigration and colonization project. No, and the Chinese men brought over were called colono asiático. That term never changed in official documents. They were called Asian colonists. Okay, but they were commonly known as coolies. So I use that term too because I wanted that term to be also known. Now, why was this contract called a labor migration, this basically labor migration, human trafficking project depicted as an immigration and colonization project. Well, let's look at this. The agency, the government office handling the Chinese trafficking was called the Comisión de Población Blanca, the White Settlement Commission. And this commission was under a large government office called the Real Junta de Fomento y Colonización. The Royal Office of Fomento means development and colonization. And the head of the commission, of the sub-agency of white settlement, was none other than the leading planter of Cuba, called Julian Zulueta. Okay? But they wanted to frame this project not as a labor project, not as a labor migration, but as an immigration and colonization project, because the Comisión de Población Blanca was originally charged with trying to bring Spanish and other European colonists to Cuba. They knew that sooner or later, their dependency on slave labor, on African slave labor, would have to come to an end. And they were desperate to bring other workers, but they wanted to bring these workers from Europe as colonists to give them the promise that they would have land. And that just didn't work, because when the Canary Islanders came and other Germans came, the Gallegos came, the poorer Spaniards came, they all saw there was hardly any land to be had because the land was already monopolized by the sugar planters. So Cuba, however, was reluctant to abolish slavery by the mid of the 19th century. Cuba, the United States, and Brazil were the three holdouts in the Americas. No? The British, the French, the Dutch, they had already abolished slavery by the early 19th century. But with Cuba reluctant to abolish slavery, the Cuban government and planters decided it was safer, politically safer, to depict this human trafficking as an immigration and colonization project. But now, let's look at the Chinese. I don't imagine many of you here read Chinese, so let me read it for you. And it's a whole different picture appears. The Chinese says, first of all, the first two words here, 自愿 means voluntary. 从中国出洋至古巴岛工作 from China going overseas, not immigration, going overseas, leaving home, going overseas, going far away to Cuba Island to do what? 工作. 工作 means to work, and 合同 means a contract. So in Chinese, it was a voluntary labor contract. It was a voluntary labor contract. And this Chinese document is so incredible because written in clear handwriting is the person's name who was recruited, what hometown he was from, and how old. He was 20 years old from this town called Nam Hoi, and that's his name. Now, this is a Chinese version. Every Chinese who landed in Cuba had these bilingual contracts on their persons. No, they all carried the bilingual contracts. So they knew, even if they couldn't read the Spanish, no, many of them understood what was in the Chinese contract. If they couldn't read it, somebody else would read it to them, because as we will see, many of them were literate. They could read and write. So here is the breakdown of the Chinese contract, which I just broke down for you. So why is that so? Because the Spanish Vice Consul in Macau, for example, explained to his government, the Spanish government in 1853, in a letter he wrote to the crown, that the Chinese government prohibited its subjects from leaving the empire, that is to emigrate, to leave home, but made an exception in the case of the Americas and the Indies or the Caribbean, that some men could leave home to work temporarily, as you will see. So they allow this little exception. But in China, all through the 19th century, it was against the law to leave home and family and lineage and all your responsibilities. It's a very confusing thing. your responsibilities to your family, to your ruler, to your, no, you could not abandon them permanently. But exceptions were made to work overseas. No, 出洋 go overseas means to work. There was no word in Chinese in the up through the 19th century for immigration. This concept of immigration, as we understand it in the West, is to leave home and settle someplace else. No, this concept didn't exist. There was no term. And that's why in the Chinese contract, even if they had wanted to, they couldn't have translated this idea of immigration and colonization, because the Chinese did not acquire territories overseas. China was a continental empire, and it did not allow its people to leave home permanently to settle overseas. So the Chinese contract was 8 years of servitude, never changed. The wages of 4 pesos a month very rarely varied. And then food, clothing, some 3 days off a year, Sundays off. Oh, these are the terms that didn't change. And also, the contract was written in the voice, in the first person voice of the Chinese man who signs the contract. And I say man because all 125,000 of them were men. No, because the Chinese government says, even if we allow some to leave home to work, no women can ever leave home to work. Women must stay home and maintain the family plot and the lineage relationships. So this term, I am obligated for 8 years to work in Cuba, as determined ever buys this contract. No, for 8 years, I am in the total command of my master. I subject myself to the orders and rules and regulations, etc. No? I subject myself to the punishments and sanctions for failure to apply. All of this, no? For 8 years, he pretty much gives up his own power and autonomy to work for a master. But look at this. I would be free to work as I wish without being forced to extend this contract, not even under the pretext of debt, obligations, or promises that I have made. No? While under 8 years, I give up all my rights. But once the 8 years are completed, I will be free. I will be a free person. That's what the contract says. So let's look at some of the regulations governing this yellow trade. 1849, when the trade began, the regulations provided for something taken out of slavery, called coartation or manumission. No, it allows the Chinese contract worker to buy out the rest of his contract if he had the money. It's called rescinding the contract. No, you could buy out your contract. 1854, another set of regulations was applied to all colonists, Spanish, Chinese, and also Yucateco, because the Cubans also went not far to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and recruited some Mayan Indians from the Yucatan to come and work on the sugar plantations. But I want you to look at 1860. 1860, a new regulation was enacted that was directed only at the Chinese, and it requires something called recontracting. What is recontracting? This is really the crux of the situation, that once the term that is prefixed is over, meaning once the original 8 years are completed, look at the height, I must renew it or sign another one with an employer of my choosing, or else leave the island at my expense, or be taken to the holding cell for runaways, to the jail, to the prison. So 1860, everything changed with the Chinese. No? Originally, the original contract says you finish your 8 years, you can be a free man. But then they put in place this 1860 law that says you must recontract. Now, people interpret this then as saying, for sure now, the Chinese were no different from slaves, because they were bound to be unfree, no? To finish the original contract and then to recontract, and it's indefinitely interpreted as indefinite recontracting. That they must recontract and recontract. No? It seems like the fate was sealed, that they could not ever be free. That's what you might think if you end your research right here and say, okay, they're doomed. But what I did here at Bonn, at the BCDSS last summer, was I located over 100 of these recontracts. And that's the first set of documents I want to examine with you very, very closely and tell you the stories of some of these Chinese men who had to recontract and how they recontracted. Okay? Now, I've examined over 100 of these recontracts, or I say subcontracts, that I really should mean recontracts, spanning the years from 1861. Remember, the new regulation was enacted in 1860. So you start seeing recontracts in 1861 until 1877. That's the last set of recontracts that I was able to locate and examine. No, this whole period, 1861 to 1877. Now, these early contracts in the 1860s, early 1860s, tended to be for smaller pay, but always more than the 4 pesos of the original contract. No, they could be for 5 pesos, for 6 pesos. For example, in June 1861, one of the earlier recontracts, Dionisio, by the way, these Chinese, just like those slaves brought over from Africa, they were all given a Western name. They call them a Christian name. No? And oftentimes they didn't have a surname, or they took the master's surname, the owner of the contract. Dionisio recontracted for 2 years with his original owner or patrono at 5 pesos a month. And he signed the contract with a simple Chinese character. This means 10, 2 strokes. It's one of the simplest Chinese characters. It's not an actual surname, but it is a Chinese character. By 1868, the pay had increased notably. Ricardo, for example, signed for only 6 months at 12.5 pesos monthly. No, shorter time period, much more pay. This is towards the end of the 1860s. The really later recontracts, the ones in 1877, after, as I will tell you, the trade had officially ended, but many were still under contract, all the recontracts in this late period indicated terms of 1 to 4 years and substantially higher payment as 17 pesos monthly. So what I'm going to do, and I made a copy for you, is to examine closely one of these recontracts. Because of all the Cuban and American scholars, Cuban historians who've studied extensively this Chinese contract labor history, very few of them really paid attention to these recontracts. I may be the first one to seriously consider them and to consider, as I said, over 100 of them. And let me share with you what I have found. This recontract is of a person called Valentin Ho. I've circled it, okay? Oh, by the way, these recontracts were only in Spanish. There was no Chinese because they were negotiated locally, no, by the local political authority. In this case, it's in a town called Guanajuato, not far from Havana. And the name of the coolie is called Valentin Ho. He kept his last name Ho, but he got a Western Christian name, Valentin. What else about Valentin Ho? Valentin Ho says, I have finished my 8-year contract with Vicente Vega, my original owner or master. But now I'm going to sign with Genaro Abascal. It's not as clear name, but let me tell you something about Genaro Abascal. Because in this contract, very small print, they identified Genaro Abascal as Asiatico, Asian, even though the name is not Asian. So who was Bernardo Abascal? He was the one who recontracted Valentin. And he was Chinese, because look down here. This is Bernardo Abascal, and he signed his name with a Chinese common surname called Lam. No? Lin, L-I-N. So he signed as the contractor, no? And Bernardo Abascal, turns out, you begin to realize, was a labor contractor. He was a fellow Chinese who was no longer under contract, who then agrees to recontract several of his co-ethnics, his countrymen, to do a job for a plantation owner. So in other words, the plantation owner says, look, I don't want to have to deal with direct labor relations. Let me just get a subcontractor, a Chinese, a person of their own ethnic group who speaks the language, or understands them. I'll give this person a lump sum of money, and he is going to recontract a certain number of Chinese who had to recontract because they have finished their original 8 years. No? And so how long did he recontract? This one says un año, for only 1 year. No? And now this is a signed in 1869. And Valentin Ho was also not literate because he couldn't sign his name, but he signed with another Chinese character, very simple. Da, big, 3 strokes. Remember, Dionysio signed 10, 2 strokes. This one signed Da, big, 3 strokes, but it's a Chinese character. I want to talk to you about what it means when they sign their contracts, even not with a name, but with a character. Anyway, so what else is it? 1 year, and then here's another very important thing. For how much? For media once, for half an ounce of gold. No? For half an ounce of gold. That means real money. Money, current. Half an ounce of gold. Why? Let's look at what all this subcontract tells us. First of all, Valentin Ho was described in this subcontract as a colono asiático. He's still using that term. He had completed his 8-year contract with Vicente Vega. He signed a new 1-year contract with Genaro Abascal, also described as an Asian, whose Chinese name Lin. So he was what we call in Spanish an enganchador, a Chinese labor contractor. Valentin also signed, not with a name, but with a simple character. And payment was to be in hard currency. Media once fuerte. Fuerte means strong or hard. Half an ounce. What else does this tell us? The enganchador, I told him already how they work. No, he receives a lump sum, out of which he pays those that he recontracts. He supplies them with tools. He supplies them with clothing. He supplies them with food, no, to complete a specific charge. For example, clearing the fields for the new planting. Then I looked at many more of these recontracts, and this is what I found, that the pay, the monthly pay, varies greatly and substantially. 7 pesos, 8.5, 10, 12, 12.75, 13, 14, and up to 17. The terms of servitude was usually much briefer than the original 8 years, 1 to 2 years, but could be as short as 3 months and 6 months. And payment was always in real money, either in media once fuerte, half an ounce of gold, or sometimes it's stipulated as billete de Banco Español, bills of the Bank of Spain, real money, real currency, right? Why is that? Because what we found out is during the original 8-year contract, many of those plantation owners didn't really pay the workers in real money, but in these vouchers. Now, we've known that in labor history, the use of vouchers was quite common in many company towns, mining company towns, other company towns. It's not real money, right? And the Chinese workers learned in recontracting. We don't want any more payment in vouchers. We want real money. We don't want to work as long as 8 years, not even close to 8 years. We want to work short term, and we want much higher pay. So how does one conclude by examining all these recontracts? I say there was a labor market at work. The workers were able to negotiate much better terms for themselves. No, shorter terms of bondage, much higher pay, real money. No, a labor market was at work, that the workers could say, this is what we demand, and we agree to sign if you agree. But I look at it also from the other side. From the employer's point of view, it was also something not entirely problematic or negative, because they were no longer obligated for 8 years of feeding and clothing a worker. No, that was always the reason for why slavery as a labor system was called irrational, economically irrational, because you have to keep that person alive. No, so from the employer's point of view, it was probably also advantageous to be able to negotiate these different terms. But what I am suggesting in looking at all these labor contracts is that something was at work. There was negotiation going on. And the leverage that the workers had or the owners had was based on the labor market. No? Supply and demand of labor. Okay? Then also the significance of signing name. I looked at these recontracts and I say, look deeper. These are recontracts made by persons, real persons, who examine their own situation and try to get as much of an advantageous position for themselves as possible, given the labor market forces. So, but I looked at the signatures being very important too, because it suggests to me that whenever possible, these Chinese workers who lost their names, many of them, no, they wanted to express their humanity, no, their dignity by signing their name, their dignity. So I want to share with you some of these signatures. It's very interesting. I already told you that some of the illiterate workers just sign with a Chinese character, a very simple one, but it's still an expression of that person's identity, personality, humanity. No, I am a real person. I am signing. But look at these. Here is a really interesting recontract. And again, if you read Chinese, it's very interesting. It says here, supposedly the signature of the worker who signs this recontract. He says, 立合同仁一年 Asan. His name is Asan. No, Asan, that's his name. And he says, I am signing this recontract for 1 year. No? But here's what's really interesting. This is the signature of the witness to this contract. The Spaniards are very legalistic. They have to have witnesses. And in most of these recontracts, the witness is a local Cuban guy, no, that works for the plantation owner or the contractor. But in this case, the person signing as a witness, we know his name. Here is his name. Zhang, his surname is Zhang. 兄弟, he signs it, Brother Zhang. 亲笔, by the personal hand of Brother Zhang. And who is Brother Zhang? This is what's interesting. Huh? 飞马红蓝 is the name of a secret society, or what we call a sworn brotherhood. So lots of indications as what's going on, no? Now, I mentioned earlier they were mostly from Canton, which meant that they were of great affinity to each other. They spoke the same language. They had the same folk culture and religion, no? They were related, many of them, to the same lineage, or what we call the clan in Western scholarship. It's really important, too, that when they go overseas, whether it's to California, Canada, and Cuba, they form these, oftentimes in Western literature, called secret societies. They're really Landmannschaften in German, no? They are brotherhoods. They are mutual aid societies to help each other survive and thrive even, no? So here we find that Brother Zhang, who signs as a witness, represents a secret society. Let me share with you another signature page. I don't have a copy of this because I couldn't make a copy in the archive, but I found 3 contracts signed at the same time by 3 individuals in 1877. So it looks like they were 3 contracts negotiated and signed, executed at the same time. No? But look how they signed their name. They didn't sign the Chinese with their real names. One of them signed Wei Lai Lao Dao, which means a future leader of the Taoist way. The other guy signed it Lao Jiahua. The one in the middle means this old guy. No? And the third one signed Xian Dao. Xian Dao means an immortal of the Taoist way. Taoist is a folk religion, a popular folk religion. So these 3 apparently buddies who signed the exact same recontract, same terms, the same person, everything, and they signed their respective contracts with these, what I call whimsical or musing ways that only they understood. The Spaniards, the Cubans who executed this didn't know what they were doing. No, that's how I read into it. There's some humor going on here. But again, I read it as an expression of their humanity, of them attempting to express their humanity, no, their personality. Okay, what's another kind of primary document I found? Besides these recontracts, another set of documents, very interesting. It's called Petition for Residency. Remember in the original 8 years says, when I finish my 8-year contract, I live as a free person? Well, to live as a free person in Cuba, you have to have a certificate of residency. And it's basically your ID card. So there are these different residency papers. Cédula de vecindad. No, cédula is a government document, certificate vecindad of residency. And some of these residencies have underneath it, cabeza de familia, head of a family or head of a household. Then there's another kind of residency papers called carta de domicilio, no, letter of domicile, no, again, residency. And then the third one is really interesting, naturalización, naturalization as a Spanish subject. Some of these Chinese actually requested naturalization as a Spaniard. And finally, the 4th kind of residency papers I discovered were those issued by the Chinese consulate in Cuba when it was first established in 1880. And it says this subject, this person is a Chinese national, Chinese subject. So they could also register as a Chinese subject. But here, when you register as a Chinese subject with a certificate issued by the Chinese consulate, they were always identified as transeunte. Transeunte means you're transitory, you're passerby, you're not a permanent resident, you're not a permanent, person who lives here. And in English, in Western American literature about Asian Americans in California, we tend to use the word sojourner, that you're just passing by, that you're just temporarily in Cuba. Okay, they're always identified as transeunte. So let's look at a few cases that I've been able to track the personal story of. First, there's a coolie called Sisto Campa. Sisto arrived in 1856 from Macau. The shippings left Macau from 1856. All the ships carrying coolies left from Macau because the British says, we don't want to have anything to do with this human trafficking. The Portuguese say, come to Macau. We'd be happy to work with you. So 56, when did he finish his contract? 64, upon expiration of his original 8-year contract. He then recontracted with the same owner for 1 year, which was required by law. Remember, 1860. But in 1865, in February, he recontracted again for 1 year with another boss called Francisco de la Campa at 10 pesos a month. 1 year at 10 pesos. And he took Francisco de la Campa's surname, Sisto de la Campa. So his name became Sisto Campa. What else is Sisto Campa? He petitioned in 1866 after serving 2 recontracts. He says, I'm not going to keep recontracting. I'm going to ask for a permanent residency card. So he petitioned for Carta de Domicilio, sponsored by his boss, Francisco de la Campa, who acted as a character witness. When you apply for residency, you have to submit certain documents, one of which is a character witness, somebody who says he's always acted with good conduct. But what else does he have to do? He has to be baptized first. So he must show in his petition for residency a certificate from the local parish priest that he agreed to be a Christian. So he was baptized. So he submitted, Sisto, along with a big package, his baptism record at the parish of Nuestra Senora la Virgen de Carmen, no, Our Lady of the Virgin of Carmen. And what's really interesting, and I won't have time to go now, but I want to kind of tease you all a little bit. The local parish priest, when he baptizes people, he has to register the baptism. And he only has 2 books, one for white, blancos, and one for pardos, what they call one for people of color. Sisto Campa, the coolie, was registered in the white book. No? Because there was no 3rd book. No, so the local parish priest exercises his judgment and said, no, I'm going to register him as a white. Now, I have found other of these requests where the Chinese was registered with the other set of books, the one for people of color, of blacks. Okay, so it means it's a situational variable. So, and then Sisto has to declare in the petition that they choose to remain in Cuba permanently. That's why they want the residency. Here's another one, Saturnino, who also signs his name. His hometown, he tells, he departed from Hong Kong in 1855 at the age of 22. He recontracted in February 1864 for 1 year and 9 pesos. Then he recontracted again in February 65 for another year, this time also with Francisco de la Campa, no, at 10 pesos a month, and he also applied for his residency. Roque Guerra, this is very interesting. Roque Guerra, his original 8-year contract, what he included in his petition, and many of those who submit petition for permanent residence actually submitted the original bilingual 8-year contract, which means that this person kept his original Spanish-Chinese contract on his person and submitted that along with his petition. Then the baptism by the parish priest, then the testimony of good conduct, and then Roque, this is what's interesting about Roque. He did not seek to recontract. He jumped directly from finishing his original contract to apply for permanent residency. Okay, so I'm just showing you, when you look at these local documents that are really grassroots, ground level documents, you begin to see a different picture. That the enforcement of the recontract law was not 100% strict, that there were all kinds of local variations of that. I want to share with you. This one is really interesting. The Asiatico Ambrosio Urquinaga, he had this fancy German, Spanish name, who signs his name in Chinese. Can you see his name in Chinese? I circled it, right? He petitions, and he uses a word here. He uses the word manumission, which means I seek my freedom. No, I seek my freedom. 1862, quite early in the required recontracting period. But he petitions, says, I seek my manumission. No, he attaches his original 1854 contract, and he says, I want to remain in this island permanently as a free person with a residency card. He wanted to bypass the whole recontracting. This is one of the residency cards you can see, Cédula de Vecindad. And can you see right at the top, right under, if you read Spanish, says cabeza de familia. No, right here, head of family. Head of family. Now, who is a head of a family? Let me show you this. There several other petitions for naturalization. Let me tell you the story of Ricardo Benaval. In 1873, I made a mistake. He was at 37 working as a cook. He became a naturalized Spanish citizen. He was granted residency in 66. First, he got his residency card, and then he asked to be naturalized as a Spanish subject. He requested for naturalization. Same thing with Leonardo Valdez, no? And what he said in his petition is very interesting for naturalization. Remember, to get residency, you have to declare that you voluntarily wish to stay permanently in Cuba. But to be naturalized, you have to go further. What he said is that he renounced all privileges and protection of a foreign government, meaning his original government, and was not maintaining a relationship with the country of his birth. That's in the naturalization papers. Now, this guy is really interesting, Agustin Cisneros. He called himself an Asiatico Libre. He said, I'm a free Asian, you know, and I'm requesting Spanish citizenship, 1871. He said by 1871, he had lived in Cuba for 34 years, and he had been a permanent resident of Cuba since 1866, when he was 29 years old. He is working as a cook, and he's a widower with 4 young children. His wife was a Yucateca Indian, a Mayan Indian, called Lorenza Pastor, a Mayan Indian, but she passed away, leaving him with 4 children. So he submitted his residency card, which also states that he's cabeza de la familia, that he's head of a family, and he applies for naturalization. And in the interview for naturalization, he was asked, why do you want to be a Spanish subject? And he says, because I have children born in a Spanish province, born in Cuba. My children are all born here in Cuba, no? And I want to become a Spanish subject for my children. No? This Asiatic. So here's a naturalization card. No? Okay, so let's take stock of what happened. 1872, 14,000 Chinese had completed the original contract. 14,000 received the carta de domicilio or cédula, received a residency card, 14,000 of them. And all they had become naturalized, or they were registering as a foreign resident, meaning they were free. They were no longer under contract. 34,000 in 1872 were still under contract. 7,000 were deserters. 864 were fugitives, captured, and many of them serving in jail. Now, 1872, the Cuban government did the census and could account for 57,000 Chinese out of the 115 or so imported to Cuba by 1872. So they could account for half of them. No? Many of them probably died. They didn't keep track of that, not that I have found. But I still think this is a pretty good reckoning, no, accounting of how many. Registering as a foreign national. I told you they could also register from 1880 on with a Chinese consulate. This ID allows the individual to have what in Chinese is called hangaiji, walking papers, that he could walk the streets with this paper on him as a free person who is a transeunte, a passing through. And this is, look, Consulado General Imperial de China, no? The imperial consulate, no? The consulate of the Chinese Empire. And at the back of this certificate is a set of what they call prevenciones or precautions attached to the back of this guy, Asan here, no? And it says, you have to carry this paper with you. You have to show it every time you ask for work, to conduct official business, to press charges to anybody, to claim credits, to open or manage a business. You must carry this ID card with you. So this is another kind of ID card. Finally, what is another way to gain freedom? No? Marriage to a white woman. to get manumission or coartation, to buy out your contract. Both of these options depended on having money. So you ask, how could a coolie earning 4 pesos a month for 8 years and then a few pesos more a month accumulate enough money to buy out his freedom, to rescind his contract, meaning to cancel the contract, and to marry a white woman? Well, let me tell you how. What do you think? You win the lottery. You win the lottery. And I have found 3 cases of lottery winners. And why lottery is important is that the Cubans, people of Latin America, all over Latin America today, lottery is a really popular thing, particularly for the popular classes. But guess what? The Chinese also play the lottery, and they brought the lottery game to Cuba. And the Cubans loved the Chinese lottery too so much, they actually adopted the Chinese lottery. But let me tell you the story of an Asiatico Asian by the name of Julian Guisen. In 1861, Julian was under contract at 33 years old. In 1863, his patrono, his owner of his contract, the local priest, transferred his contract to a local white woman called Doña Crescencia Perez, who promptly married him. This marriage was recorded in the white marriage registry. That's the other registry that the local parish keep. One for baptism, one for marriage. And Julian Guisen's marriage to Doña Crescencia Perez, who was identified as the hija legítima, the legitimate daughter of so-and-so, a white woman. Their marriage was registered in the white registry book, And then Doña Crescencia Perez, after marriage, immediately petitioned for the rescission of the contract, rescisión de la contrata, for her Chinese husband, and grant him his naturalization papers so that he could, and I quote, do things that other free men do. So how did this happen? Turns out Julian had won a lottery. He had won a big lottery, and he had more than sufficient money to buy out his contract. Okay, here's another one. Eloy, also identified as a Colonia Asiatico. Wow, in 1858, this is very early, he won a huge lottery of 1,873 pesos, which was a fortune at the time. He petitioned to use 219 pesos to cancel his contract, rescindir su contrata, and become, I'm using the word in the petition, emancipated, free. Then he requested a carta de domicilio, a residency card, he says, as a first step towards ultimately petitioning to become a Spanish subject. So it's quite early. All right. And finally, I have the colono. He's identified as a colonist, Malquina. In 1858, having won the lottery, he also petitions for rescisión de la contrata, to cancel his contract, to buy out his contract. You have to pay the person who buys your contract the remainder value of your contract. And he also expressed desire to remain on the island permanently. He was baptized with a new name, Jose Maria Gil, after paying off his patrono, his owner, Francisco de la Maza. He says he plans to use the rest of his lottery earnings as, and the word he used was capital, to start a new life. He then bought an urban lot, an urban property, and lives in Havana. And then his request for residency was granted by the Crown Attorney, the fiscal. Okay. So just show you a few of these images of the Chinese, This is a Chinese in rebellion. These are carrying the cane to the refinery. And this is a cigar wrapper, featuring the Chinese on one side, just to show you that how prevalent they have become in Cuban popular culture, right? Okay, finally, I want to tell very quickly, I know my time is running late, something called the Cuba Commission Report. In 1873-74, because of the worldwide outrage against the human trafficking, the Chinese government, Qing government, sent 3 commissioners to investigate the situation on the plantations and how the Chinese are on these plantations, what life was like for them. So the 3 commissioners, number 1 was Chen Lanbin. He became the first ambassador to Cuba, but the ambassador was to Cuba, to the US, and to Spain, okay? Because Cuba was still part of Spain. Chen Lanbin, but look at the other 2 commissioners. One was a British commissioner of customs in one of the treaty ports, that is, the ports that China was forced to open for Western trade. The other one, Monsieur Hubert, was a French commissioner. So out of the 3 commissioners, 1 was Chinese, 1 was British, 1 was French, and they issued a report that was only issued in English and in French, but not in Chinese, because it was really for Western consumption. What did the commission do? From March to May 1874, they collected testimonials. No, they visited several plantations and collected in-person testimonies from over 1,000 Chinese workers. And they wrote up the report. And what's, again, valuable for historians is that each one of the people they talked to had their Chinese name written and their hometown written. This is so rare in the history of people who are under contract or enslaved people, because very rarely, no, do the people who traffic in them keep their original names as written. But this document kept all their original names, no? And then what's really amazing is that several of the coolies who couldn't testify in person submitted written petitions or reports, written in classical Chinese, which is to tell you that among those recruited to work in Cuba were highly educated individuals. Okay, we saw some barely educated who could only scratch out on character to represent the name. But my gosh, in this Cuban Commission report, we have petitions written in classical Chinese submitted to the commission. And they asked all kinds of questions, which I don't have time to go to about. How were they treated? Did the laws provide adequately, et cetera, et cetera? Would they leave Cuba, et cetera? No, I can't go into this. You know, what was the relationship with the negros, no, with the Black people? And were they punished physically? What was their health, et cetera? But what I thought were 2 interesting questions. Have the men married, they asked. What wives? What is the condition of the wives and children? And what future have the children have before them? That's one question. The other question I thought was very interesting. Have any Chinese become wealthy socially? What is their status? To what extent does the government recognize this? So I was trying to give you a clue too, using the documents that I have access to. But I want you to listen to one testimony. A worker, a coolie called Zheng Amao. Zheng Amao said very clearly to the commissioners, we were induced to proceed to Macau by offers of employment abroad at high wages. And through being told that the 8 foreign years specified in the contracts were equivalent to only 4 Chinese years, and that at the termination of the latter period, we would be free. So they never understood themselves to be slaves, even though their treatment was horrible and they, gave lots of examples of cruel and unusual punishment. In their own mind, their own subjectivity, they were only coming to work, and they were free men. Okay, so from bondage to freedom, many of these men who were recruited to Cuba were not the dregs of society. They were not the most miserable, the most penurious. No, they were actually, many of them, highly skilled. Some of them were literate. They understood. They went overseas to work. They were alert to their circumstances. They knew their basic rights. They learned to negotiate the recontracts to gain some advantage. And many signed the recontracts with the Chinese name or character as expressions of their humanity and personality. I also want to say, by reading so many of these petitions for residency and naturalization, that they obviously had lots of help from Cubans, because they themselves, even those who barely knew some, could never have written these formal petitions. So they either probably hired some lawyer or hired somebody or had advocates who wrote these petitions out for them. And I have to investigate that further, exactly who wrote these petitions for them and on what conditions, etc. No? And then, of course, they pushed the boundaries of the law. They gained the recontracting requirement, trying to skip it entirely and always to negotiate for better terms. And a few of them were lucky. They were not slaves, despite what many historians, both in Cuba and outside Cuba, both then at the time and even to this day, claim, oh, these Chinese contract laborers were just slaves. It's an extension of slavery. And I am saying, and when I write my book, I will say that they were not slaves. They were able to gain their freedom in one lifetime. No, they figured out a way to negotiate. No? So this presentation addresses the question of unfreedom and freedom, the transition from bondage to freedom, far from constitution and extension of slavery, bound for life to one master. The Chinese more accurately constituted a step in the labor history of Cuba towards free or wage labor. During the recontracting period, you could see that they were actually a working class, or the beginning, an incipient working class, working for wages under terms that both time and wages that they could best negotiate for themselves. So let me finish with two great Cuban historians. One is Juan Jimenez Pastrana. He says, the coolie was theoretically not a slave because he was salaried. And as such, he represented an early step in the rise of our working class. The Chinese colono was really an agricultural worker with a miserable salary, whose socioeconomic situation must be included in the history of the Cuba labor movement. And Moreno Frajinals, who's Cuba's preeminent historian of sugar, says this: the Chinese constituted the first step in solving the labor problem, which permitted the beginning of industrialization of sugar. It effected the transition from manufacturing to industrial production. During the period when the Chinese were in Cuba, working on the plantation, the Cuban sugar economy itself transitioned to what is called an industrial model of production. Okay, and the Chinese were right there doing a lot of the more skilled labor in the what we call the factory in the field. Okay, thank you very much.